For 40 years, Hester and Elmer were the epitome of devotion. Their love had weathered decades, and even after Elmer's paralysis left him confined to a wheelchair, Hester remained by his side, caring for him with tireless dedication. But one day, a chilling discovery unraveled everything Hester thought she knew about her husband and herself. This is a story of loyalty, betrayal, and a secret so shocking it changed everything. What would you do if the person you trusted most turned out to be hiding a life-altering truth? Tonight, we dive into the gripping tale of Hester and Elmer, a story that reminds us how even the closest bonds can harbor dark secrets. Hester and Elmer first met on a chilly autumn evening at a church social in their small, picturesque town. The year was 1965, and the world was buzzing with change. But in that cozy hall, time seemed to stand still. Hester was 24, full of life, with sparkling eyes that drew people in effortlessly. She was the kind of woman who could light up a room with just her laughter. Elmer, on the other hand, was her opposite, a reserved and thoughtful man with a quiet charm that caught Hester's attention the moment she saw him. Their connection was instant. Elmer offered her a cup of punch, and they spent the evening talking in the corner of the hall, oblivious to everyone else. By the end of the night, they had exchanged phone numbers and plans for their next meeting. Within a year, they were married, and their future looked as bright as the stars they often gazed at on their evening walks. Hester and Elmer were the kind of couple everyone admired. They weren't wealthy or particularly extraordinary, but their love for each other was palpable. Together, they built a life filled with small joys, planting tulips in their garden, taking Sunday strolls along the river, and sharing coffee on their porch every morning. Hester always said that Elmer was her anchor, the steady presence that kept her grounded. Elmer, in turn, often told friends, "Hester is my light. She makes the darkest days brighter." But as the years passed and life took its toll, their idyllic story would face challenges neither of them could have anticipated. When Elmer suffered a devastating stroke at 72, their world turned upside down. The man who had once stood tall and strong was now confined to a wheelchair, paralyzed from the waist down. Doctors told them his condition was permanent, and he would need round-the-clock care. It was a cruel twist of fate, but Hester didn't hesitate for a moment. "We'll get through this together," she told him, her voice steady despite the fear she felt inside. Hester's days became a routine of caregiving. She woke up early every morning to prepare his meals and organize his medications. She helped him bathe, dressed him, and wheeled him to his favorite spot by the window so he could watch the birds outside. Evenings were spent reading to him or watching old movies they both loved. It was exhausting, physically and emotionally, but Hester never once complained. She loved Elmer, and she saw it as her duty to care for him. Friends often marveled at her devotion. "Hester, you're an angel," they would say. But behind her warm smile, Hester carried the weight of loneliness and sacrifice. She missed the life they once had, the partnership they had shared. Now, everything revolved around Elmer's needs, and her own dreams seemed like distant memories. But despite the hardships, Hester found small moments of joy in their routine. She loved the way Elmer's face lit up when she brought him a cup of tea or told him about the antics of the neighborhood cats. She clung to these moments, believing that their love was strong enough to carry them through anything. Little did she know, cracks were beginning to form beneath the surface of their seemingly unshakable bond. It started with little things, so subtle that Hester almost didn't notice them at first. Late one night, while she was folding laundry, she heard a faint buzz coming from Elmer's nightstand. It was his phone, something he hadn't used in years since the stroke had left his hands too weak to manage it. Curious, Hester picked it up and saw a single message flash on the screen. "Did you tell her yet?" There was no name attached, just a number she didn't recognize. Hester brushed it off, thinking it might have been a wrong number. But then, other strange things began to happen. She found scraps of paper tucked under the cushion of Elmer's wheelchair, scribbled with phone numbers and initials she couldn't place. Once, while tidying his study, she noticed a bank statement for an account she didn't recognize. It wasn't a joint account, and the transactions, small, regular withdrawals, seemed out of place for a man who rarely left the house. Elmer also began to act differently. He had always been a quiet man, but now there was a tension in him that Hester couldn't quite explain. When she entered the room unexpectedly, he would glance away, his expression tight. When she asked if he needed anything, his answers were short and distracted. At first, Hester told herself it was nothing. Perhaps Elmer was simply frustrated with his condition. But as the weeks went on, her unease grew. Then came the visitors. One rainy afternoon, while returning from the market, Hester noticed a man leaving their house. He was dressed in a dark coat and hat, his face partially obscured, but he walked quickly as if he didn't want to be seen. Hester asked Elmer who it was, but he waved her off. "Just an old friend," he said curtly. It wasn't like Elmer to be so dismissive, and Hester's suspicion deepened. Her mind raced with questions. Was Elmer hiding something from her? Was there a part of his life she didn't know about? She hated to think this way about her husband, the man she had loved for so many years. But the signs were there, and they were becoming impossible to ignore. One night, as she lay in bed beside him, staring at the ceiling, Hester resolved to find out the truth. Whatever Elmer was hiding, she would uncover it, even if it meant shattering the life they had built together. One afternoon, while tidying up the bedside table, Hester stumbled upon something she'd never seen before, a small stack of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. The envelopes were aged, their edges yellowed with time, and the handwriting on them was unmistakable. It was Elmer's. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest as she thumbed through them. Each one was addressed to someone named Evangeline. The name stopped her in her tracks. Hester didn't know anyone by that name, and in all their years together, Elmer had never mentioned her. Curiosity and a creeping sense of unease got the better of her. She carefully untied the ribbon, her trembling hands fumbling with the knot. The first letter began innocuously enough, but as she read further, her breath caught in her throat. "I think of you every day," Elmer had written. "Life hasn't been the same without you. I'll always love you, Evangeline." Hester's eyes scanned the page in disbelief. The words were intimate, raw, and written with a tenderness she hadn't seen in Elmer in years. She placed the letter back on the pile and stared at the bundle as if it might explode in her hands. Who was this woman? Was she someone from before their marriage? A long-lost love Elmer had never spoken of? Or worse, was she someone he'd been in contact with throughout their life together? The questions swirled in Hester's mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Instead of confronting Elmer immediately, Hester decided to put the letters back exactly as she'd found them. Her heart ached with every step as she left the room, her mind racing with possibilities. She spent the rest of the day in a fog, going through her usual routines, but unable to stop replaying those words in her head. "I'll always love you, Evangeline." The phrase echoed in her mind like a haunting refrain. That night, as Elmer dozed in his wheelchair by the fire, Hester sat across from him, studying his face. He looked peaceful, unaware of the turmoil churning inside her. She wanted to demand answers, to confront him about the letters and the woman he had so clearly loved. But fear held her back. What if the truth was more painful than she could handle? What if, after all these years, she discovered that their life together had been built on a foundation of lies? The next day, Hester decided to search for more clues. She needed to know the full truth before she confronted Elmer. In his study, a place she rarely ventured, she noticed a locked drawer in the old roll-top desk. It wasn't unusual for Elmer to keep personal items locked away, but now everything seemed suspicious. She rummaged through the house until she found an old keyring in the kitchen drawer. One by one, she tried each key until finally the lock clicked open. The drawer was filled with papers, bank statements, receipts, and documents Hester didn't recognize. But what drew her attention immediately was a photograph tucked beneath the pile. She pulled it out, her hands shaking. It was a picture of Elmer, younger and smiling, with his arm around a beautiful woman. She wasn't Hester. It was Evangeline. Hester sank into the chair behind her, staring at the photograph as though it might offer her some explanation. The woman was striking, with dark hair and a radiant smile, and the way Elmer looked at her was unmistakable. It was the look of a man deeply in love. Hester felt her stomach churn. This wasn't just a fleeting romance from Elmer's past. This was something much deeper. Beneath the photograph were bank statements that painted an even more troubling picture. They showed years of small, consistent withdrawals from an account Hester hadn't known existed. The withdrawals were modest, just enough to avoid suspicion, but they added up to thousands over the years. The pattern suggested that someone else had access to the account, and Hester could only assume it was Evangeline. That evening, as she prepared dinner, Hester felt like a stranger in her own home. Every glance at Elmer filled her with questions she wasn't ready to ask. She watched him closely, noting the little things she had never paid attention to before, the way he avoided her gaze when she asked casual questions, the way he grew quiet whenever the doorbell rang or the phone buzzed. It was as though he had been hiding in plain sight all these years, and she had never noticed. But the moment that truly unsettled her came late that night. As she lay in bed beside him, staring at the ceiling, she noticed the faint glow of his phone on the nightstand. She reached for it, her fingers hesitating just above the screen. The most recent message was from an unknown number. It read, "We need to talk. Soon." The next morning, Hester decided to call one of the numbers she had found, scribbled on a piece of paper tucked into Elmer's wheelchair cushion. Her heart raced as the phone rang. On the third ring, a woman's voice answered. "Hello?" The voice was soft, unfamiliar, and yet something about it sent a chill down Hester's spine. Hester introduced herself, trying to keep her voice steady. "This is Hester," she said, "Elmer's wife." There was silence on the other end of the line, a heavy pause that seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, the woman spoke, her voice trembling. "I think we should meet," she said. "There's something you need to know." Hester agreed to meet the woman later that week, though every part of her body screamed to cancel, to avoid hearing whatever truths this stranger held. Her hands trembled as she prepared herself for the meeting. What would she say? What would she hear? What if this woman, Evangeline, shattered everything Hester thought she knew about her life? But deep down, Hester knew she couldn't live with the not knowing. The cafe was small and quiet, tucked away in the corner of town, a place where few people would recognize her. Hester arrived early, the nervous energy inside her making it impossible to stay still. She ordered tea, though she had no intention of drinking it, and sat by the window, staring at the empty chair across from her. Then the bell above the door jingled, and there she was. Evangeline was older than the woman in the photograph, her hair streaked with grey and her eyes softened by time, but there was no mistaking her. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, her head held high even as she hesitated at the table, unsure of how to begin. "Hester?" she asked, her voice gentle but steady. Hester nodded, unable to speak. Evangeline sat down slowly, clasping her hands together on the table. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The air between them was heavy, filled with unspoken tension. Finally, Hester broke the silence. "I found the letters," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. "And the photograph. I need to know who you are. I need to know the truth." Evangeline took a deep breath and began to speak. "Elmer and I met before he ever knew you," she said. "We were young and we were in love, but life got in the way, as it often does. He went his way and I went mine. I thought that was the end of it." She paused, her eyes glistening. But it wasn't. Evangeline explained that years later, after Elmer had already married Hester, he reached out to her. At first it was just letters, reminiscing about the past, sharing memories of what could have been. But the letters didn't stop. They turned into phone calls, secret meetings, and eventually a quiet, ongoing connection that had lasted decades. "He told me he loved you," Evangeline said quickly, as if trying to soften the blow. "He said he could never leave you, but he couldn't let go of me either." Hester felt like the room was spinning. The words hit her like a physical blow, each one carving into her heart. She struggled to keep her composure, but her voice cracked as she asked, "Why now? Why keep this going for so long?" Evangeline hesitated. "Because I loved him," she admitted. "And I thought he loved me too. But over the years I began to see that he wasn't being fair to either of us. I tried to end it more than once, but he always found a way to pull me back in. I don't know if he ever meant to hurt you, Hester, but I know he did." The betrayal was almost too much to bear. Hester couldn't believe that the man she had given her entire life to, the man she had cared for, sacrificed for, had been living a lie for all these years. She thought of the long nights spent at his side, the endless hours of care and devotion. All the while, he had been sending money, writing letters, and holding on to a woman he couldn't let go of. Hester didn't know how she managed to make it through the rest of the meeting. Evangeline seemed genuinely remorseful, but that didn't make the truth any easier to swallow. They parted with a quiet goodbye, and as Hester walked home, the weight of what she'd learned pressed down on her like a storm cloud. When she got home, she stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at Elmer as he sat by the window, oblivious to her turmoil. He looked so frail, so dependent on her, and yet, in her eyes, he had never seemed more of a stranger. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but she knew this wasn't a conversation she could have in anger. So she waited. She spent the night lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, rehearsing what she would say. The next morning, Hester couldn't wait any longer. She wheeled Elmer into the living room and sat across from him, the letters, the photograph, and the bank statements spread out on the coffee table between them. He looked at the items, confusion flickering across his face, and then realization. He sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping as if a heavy weight had just settled on them. "I never wanted you to find out like this," he said quietly, his voice tinged with guilt. "But I suppose I owe you the truth." And so Elmer began to tell his side of the story. He admitted to everything, his past with Evangeline, the letters, the meetings, the money. "I loved her once," he said, his voice breaking. "And I never stopped. But I love you too, Hester. I always have." The words, meant to soothe, only deepened the wound. "You love me?" Hester said, her voice trembling. "You call this love? Lying to me for decades, betraying me behind my back. Was that love, Elmer? Was it?" She couldn't hold back the tears any longer, and they streamed down her face as she stood up, overwhelmed by the enormity of what she had just heard. Elmer didn't have any answers. He tried to apologize, to explain, but his words felt hollow. Hester couldn't even look at him. She left the room, closing the door behind her, and sat in the kitchen, her head in her hands. Her heart felt like it had been ripped out of her chest. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her marriage, and her husband had been a lie. And now She was left to figure out what to do next. Hester sat at the kitchen table for what felt like hours, staring blankly at the teacup in front of her. Her hands were clasped tightly together, her knuckles white from the tension. Elmer's confession echoed in her mind, each word cutting deeper than the last. He had admitted to loving Evangeline, to sending her money, to keeping her in his life all these years. Yet he'd also said he loved Hester. How could he possibly think both were true? How could he reconcile the betrayal with the love he claimed to feel for her? The house felt different now, cold, unfamiliar, like a stranger's home. Hester glanced around at the reminders of their shared life, the photographs on the walls, the comfortable furniture they'd chosen together, the little knickknacks from their travels. It all felt hollow now, tainted by the weight of what she had learned. She had built her life around Elmer, sacrificed so much to care for him after his stroke, and now it felt as though the foundation of that life had crumbled beneath her. She decided she couldn't stay in the house, at least not for the moment. Grabbing her coat, she stepped outside into the crisp evening air. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement as she walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, her thoughts swirling. She replayed every moment of her marriage, searching for signs she might have missed. Had there been hints of his betrayal? Had she ignored the little inconsistencies over the years because she wanted to believe in the life they had built together? As she walked, she thought of her own sacrifices, the opportunities she had given up to care for Elmer, the friendships she had let drift away because she didn't have the energy to maintain them, the dreams she had quietly shelved to make his life more comfortable. And all the while, he had been writing to another woman, pouring his thoughts and feelings into letters that weren't meant for her. The unfairness of it all made her chest tighten with anger and grief. By the time Hester returned home, it was late. The house was quiet, and Elmer was in his bedroom, the light under the door casting a faint glow into the hallway. She considered going in, demanding more answers, but she knew she wasn't ready. Instead, she went to the guest room, closing the door behind her and collapsing onto the bed. Sleep didn't come easily, but eventually, exhaustion overtook her. The next morning, Hester woke with a strange sense of clarity. She couldn't keep living like this, not with the anger and betrayal festering inside her. She needed to make a decision, not just for herself, but for her future. For too long, she had defined herself by her role as Elmer's caregiver, his wife, his constant support. But now, she realized she needed to think about what she wanted, what she deserved. Hester spent the day making preparations. She called an old friend she hadn't spoken to in years, a woman named Mabel, who had always been a source of wisdom and comfort. Mabel listened patiently as Hester poured out her story, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've given so much of yourself, Hester," Mabel said gently. "But it's time to take care of yourself now. You don't owe him your life, not after what he's done." The conversation gave Hester the strength she needed. She decided she would leave. Not permanently, at least not yet, but long enough to give herself space to think. She packed a small suitcase with essentials, her movements slow but deliberate. She didn't tell Elmer what she was doing. She couldn't bear another conversation with him, not now. As she wheeled her suitcase down the hallway, she paused outside Elmer's door. The silence on the other side was deafening. She placed her hand on the doorknob, hesitating for a moment before letting go. "Not yet," she whispered to herself. She didn't owe him a confrontation, not now, not when she was still trying to process everything. Hester called a cab and left the house, the familiarity of it fading into the distance as the car pulled away. She had booked a small room at a bed and breakfast on the edge of town, a cozy place with a view of the hills. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time in years, Hester felt like she could breathe. Over the next few days, Hester began to rebuild herself piece by piece. She spent her mornings walking through the countryside, her afternoons reading books she had always meant to get to, but never had the time for. She reconnected with old friends, sharing laughter and stories over cups of tea. Slowly but surely, she began to feel like herself again. Not the version of herself that had been tied to Elmer, but the woman she had been before. But even as she embraced this newfound independence, there were moments of doubt. She thought of Elmer alone in the house, reliant on her for everything. Was she abandoning him? Was she being cruel? These thoughts gnawed at her, but she reminded herself that she hadn't created this situation. He had. His choices had led them here, and it wasn't her responsibility to fix what he had broken. One evening, as she watched the sunset from the porch of the bed and breakfast, Hester felt a strange sense of peace. She still didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. She realized that her life didn't have to be defined by Elmer's betrayal. She had the power to choose her own path, to create a future that was hers and hers alone. And as the stars began to appear in the sky, she made a silent promise to herself. No matter what happened, she would never lose herself again. She had given so much to Elmer, but now it was time to give something to herself, the chance to heal, to grow, and to rediscover the woman she had always been. Hester returned home after 2 weeks of being away. The decision hadn't been easy, but she needed closure, needed to confront the life she had left behind and decide once and for all what her future would look like. She had spent her time at the bed and breakfast reflecting, journaling, and rebuilding pieces of herself she hadn't realized were broken. But as she walked up the familiar path to the house, suitcase in hand, her stomach twisted with apprehension. Would things ever feel the same again? Could they? The house loomed before her, its quiet exterior betraying none of the turmoil that had unfolded inside it. Hester paused at the door, her key trembling in her hand. She could feel the weight of the past weeks pressing down on her, but she steadied herself and stepped inside. The smell of home greeted her, faintly comforting, but the atmosphere was different now, heavier, quieter. She called out Elmer's name, her voice echoing faintly through the halls. "I'm in the living room," came his response, weak but unmistakable. Hester braced herself and walked in. Elmer was sitting in his wheelchair by the window, just as he always did. But something about him seemed smaller, more fragile. His usual stoic expression was gone, replaced by something softer, something that almost resembled regret. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers, and for the first time in their long marriage, he seemed unsure of what to say. Hester set her suitcase down by the door and took a seat across from him, the coffee table between them a physical and emotional barrier. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. The silence was thick, each of them waiting for the other to speak first. Finally, it was Elmer who broke the stillness. "I didn't think you'd come back," he said quietly. His voice was hoarse, almost trembling, and it caught Hester off guard. Elmer had always been the type to mask his emotions, to keep his feelings buried beneath layers of composure. But now he looked vulnerable, as if he'd aged years in the short time she'd been gone. "I didn't know if I would," Hester admitted, "but I couldn't leave things unfinished. We need to talk, Elmer. Really talk." Elmer nodded slowly, his eyes downcast. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about everything, about what I did, what I've done to you. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I want to try to explain. You deserve that much." Hester folded her hands in her lap, her expression calm but unreadable. "Then explain, Elmer. Tell me why. Tell me why you thought it was okay to keep this secret from me for decades. Tell me why you betrayed me while I was standing by you, sacrificing everything for you." Elmer sighed, his shoulders slumping, as if the weight of his actions were finally too much to bear. "I don't know if there's anything I can say that will make sense of it," he began. "When I met Evangeline, I thought she was the love of my life. But things didn't work out. Life got in the way. And then I met you, and you were everything. You were kind, warm, and strong in a way I didn't think I deserved." He paused, looking up at her with pleading eyes. "But when Evangeline came back into my life, it stirred something in me I didn't know was still there. I told myself it was harmless, that keeping in touch with her wasn't hurting anyone. I never meant to betray you, Hester. I thought I could love you both." Hester's lips tightened, her hands gripping the fabric of her skirt. "But you did betray me, Elmer," she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "You took my love, my trust, and you used it to build a life that I wasn't even fully a part of. You let me sacrifice for you, care for you, while you were writing love letters to another woman. How do you justify that?" Elmer shook his head, tears glistening in his eyes. "I can't," he said. "There's no justification. I was selfish, Hester. I was a coward. I didn't want to let go of you, and I didn't want to let go of her. I thought I could have it all, but all I did was hurt the people I cared about most." Hester sat back in her chair, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. Part of her wanted to believe him, to believe that his remorse was genuine. But another part of her couldn't ignore the years of lies, the pain he had caused, the life she had given up for someone who hadn't given her the same in return. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said finally, her voice trembling. "You've taken so much from me, Elmer. My trust, my sense of security, my pride. I don't even know who I am anymore without you, and that terrifies me." Elmer nodded, his expression filled with sorrow. "I understand," he said softly. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Hester, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it, if you'll let me." Hester looked at him, searching his face for any sign of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. He was still there, she realized, but so was the man who had betrayed her. And she didn't know if she could reconcile the two. She stood, her movements deliberate, and walked to the window. The garden outside was in full bloom, vibrant and alive, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside her. She took a deep breath, the cool air calming her racing thoughts. "I don't know what's next," she said finally, turning back to face Elmer. "But I know I need time to figure out who I am, what I want. I don't know if that means staying here with you or building a life on my own, but I won't make any decisions out of guilt or obligation. Not anymore." Elmer nodded, his expression a mix of sadness and understanding. "Take all the time you need," he said quietly. "I'll be here, Hester, for as long as you'll have me." Hester left the room, her heart heavy but her mind clearer than it had been in weeks. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain. Her life wasn't over. This chapter might be ending, but a new one was beginning. And for the first time in years, it would be a chapter she wrote for herself.